Hello everybody and welcome back to DM 101. This is a brand new tutorial series I'm doing here on Tabletop Weekly, covering all sorts of different topics, but specifically for those of you who want to get into DMing or GMing tabletop role-playing games. We got a couple of things to talk about in today's episode. Today's episode is focused on pre-existing modules or pre-written adventure modules versus custom homebrew content. We're going to be talking about what is a module, what is homebrew or custom content. We're going to be talking about the pros and cons of both if you're trying to decide which one you want to run. We're going to be talking about the secret third option, and then finally I'm going to be giving you guys a little bit of homework to do after this video ends. And you can find the timestamps for all of those different segments in the video description below if you just want to jump ahead. And without much further ado, let's just crack on with it. So let's talk about what modules are and what homebrew content is as well. Modules are pre-written campaigns or adventures or worlds that have been created by the creators of a gaming system or freelance RPG writers, and they basically provide you with everything you need to run a game of that particular system just at the table. They'll provide you with encounters, worlds, history, lore, magic items, NPCs. They may even have an ongoing storyline or plot for the players to follow along with as well. They'll contain maps and artwork, and they break everything down for you, ready so that you can sit at a table, use the book to run a game. Some of these might be full campaigns. They might take you from level 1 all the way up to level 20 or very high level. Some of them might just be a few short levels and it forms more of an adventure. They might take you from levels 1 to 5, and they'll generally tie into a larger chain of events, or they'll take place in a specific campaign setting, so you as a GM can then go on to develop the story further and maybe create your own content based on that. We'll come to that in a second. Things like the Forgotten Realms campaign setting are a good example of this. They have pre-written campaigns in it, but it's also a campaign setting where all the world and history is developed for you, and you could choose to write your own adventures as well. A couple of examples of existing modules, and I'm going to use Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition as an example here, but you've got things like Curse of Strahd. This is a full campaign that takes place in its own unique campaign setting. It's not taking place in Forgotten Realms, although it does have suggestions on how to do that. It contains the villain, the major locations, the bad guys. It has custom monsters, custom magic items, all sorts of thing in here. All you need is the basic rules for D&D, one of these books, one of these modules, and you can run a full campaign. You don't need anything else, really, maybe a monster manual. But what about homebrew content then? So if modules are pre-written for you, they include all the information. Homebrew is basically the opposite. It is your custom content. We generally use it as a blanket term for tabletop role-playing games to mean custom content. It could be an adventure, it could be a world, it could be custom races, classes, monsters, that sort of thing. Homebrew basically just means created by the GM for their players, and then it can get shared outwardly. So that means that you're writing all the monsters, you're coming up with the world history, the locations, the plot lines, the villains, all of that is created by you. It can also be influenced by the players who might come up with a particular backstory, and you might want to envelop that into the world. You might even invite the players themselves to create locations or villains or places that you can use a bit later on. Of course, many modules and campaign settings have come from DMs creating their own homebrew content. Things like the Forgotten Realms, Eberron, all of these official campaign settings came from a designer's personal game or personal project that they then transitioned into a fully licensed and available to buy module. Even with the rise of popular D&D streams, things like Critical Role, Matthew Mercer's Tal'Dorei campaign setting was something he created for his friends, but now there's a book. And you too can set your own adventures in the Tal'Dorei campaign setting. It has everything you need, the world, the history, the maps, and it even has some suggestions for plot hooks, but it doesn't quite have full adventures, not like Curse of Strahd. The difference between these two is this is the world pre-written out for you to give you ideas as a setting. This is an actual adventure with everything you need to run it, from the encounters all the way down to what loot they get and all that sort of thing. Hopefully that gives you an idea of the distinction between the two, but the question is which one is right for you, especially if you're a new DM or GM. Is it better to run the pre-existing module because it's all written for you? Or does that rob you of some of the creativity and some of the joy of being a GM, of creating your own content? We're going to talk a little bit about the pros and cons of both so you can make a decision for yourselves. So let's talk about the pros and cons of these modules and custom content then. And we're going to start with modules, and specifically we're going to start with the cons. Let's get the bad stuff out of the way so we can talk about the nice stuff. So, modules. What are some of the cons for running pre-written modules and campaigns? Well, probably the major one is they are a little bit more limited. You don't have the same creative input into a pre-existing module. The storyline, the locations, the history, the NPCs, the encounters, they've all been created for you. So there's little input from the GM. You're really just kind of reading out of the book to the players what's happening. But we'll come back to this point a bit later on because there are things you can do about that. The next one is generally I find them to be majorly focused on combat encounters and dungeon exploration. This is because it's quite blanket and easy for all groups to get into. Not all groups like detailed RP encounters, so generally the modules focus on exploration, combat, dungeons, saving the world, that sort of thing. So if you're looking for a bit of variety, custom content might be the better way to go on that. They can also be, they're more expensive, let's be honest. You're buying a book to run the module, the campaign within it. Homebrew content you can completely create on your own. So you're going to have to spend money on the books, everything else. If you want to get these on digital tools, that's buying it again, etc, etc. They can also be a bit more difficult to kind of incorporate player backstory and player input into, unless the players know the campaign setting very, very well, or you can give them some hints about factions or people or NPCs that may come up. It's generally a bit harder to work their things in without having to just create a bunch of your own content again. So these tend to work better for players who might not have the most involved backstories or who are still exploring their backstories and who want to develop them over time. Finally, I personally think that with pre-written adventures, it can be a bit more tricky to improvise around them. Unless you happen to know that world very, very well, unless you've read quite in detail the actual module and the pacing and where the adventure is going to go, if your players go off the beaten track, you need to generally try and find ways to steer them back in, and that can be more difficult, especially compared to a homebrew content where that can just take you off in a new direction and lead to more fun. So those are kind of some of the cons around modules to talk about. But let's talk about the good stuff now. Let's talk about the pros. And the most obvious one is using a pre-written campaign or a pre-existing adventure saves you tons and tons of time. You don't have to create storylines, encounters, NPCs. All of that is done for you. And that saves you a ton of time leading up to the game, but also during the game itself. You just have to read through the module a few times, understand where it's going, maybe get some maps and things like print them out, get them ready, and then you can sit down to play. They're far more easier, especially for new GMs who are a little bit daunted or overwhelmed at the concept of trying to create their complete own original world and their own original adventures. Other things that you can say about modules that is quite good, they have integrated digital tools. So if you use things like Roll20 or Fantasy Grounds, most of these modules, especially the D&D 5th edition ones, will have those modules built into the package. You can buy them, it gives you all the maps, gives you all the monster stat blocks that you can show up, gives you all the handouts. Very, very convenient, especially if you're running digital tools like that. They're generally tailored, so if, for example, you have a group who loves spooky and gothic horror, running Curse of Strahd, for example, is a great fit. You know that will work well. If you have a group who you know loves dungeon crawling or loves combat, you can generally tailor certain pre-existing adventures and campaigns to them as well. My other benefit, which I think really works for them, is they have very established structure and pacing, which allows it, especially for new GMs, prevents you from like throwing them into something that's way too hard or throwing encounters at them that are a little bit too overpowered. The actual campaigns are broken down into arcs and structures, which allow you to kind of slowly and easily guide them through it, level them up quite naturally. And you have the benefit of all the writers and the staff who worked on them have years and years of experience, and so they're putting that into the modules themselves. Finally, they really provide you with a world to research more on. They give you a world that you can go out and learn more about. If you are playing in one of the Forgotten Realms campaign modules, or you're running a Forgotten Realms campaign module, there is so much information out there on the web for the Forgotten Realms that you can go and read it up, and it will give you such a better understanding of the depth and detail of that world that you can then incorporate into your game and give your players more options, and maybe even lead yourself to develop more homebrew content post the module finishing. So using these established campaign settings or established adventures can be a good way of kind of delving into something bigger than you could probably create on your own, especially to start with. Let's talk about homebrew now, and we'll start with the cons again, just to get the bad stuff out of the way. And the most obvious one here is it's a lot of work. You have to create the world, write the history, you have to develop your own monsters and NPCs and factions and gods and encounters and everything else. Running your own complete homebrew content is a bit of a daunting task. Now, obviously, you can take elements. You could use gods from the generic settings. There's a number of them established in the Player's Handbook for D&D, for example. If you're playing in something like the Star Wars universe, you don't need to really create the world. You've got all that information there, but you will need to think of like, well, what's the conflict? What plot am I driving here? Who are they going to meet? What town? Blah, 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 blah. All these different things is stuff you not only have to create in a grand scope, but also on a weekly or game-based basis. You have to come to that game with something for them to do and something to act on, and that can involve creating encounters and puzzles and everything else. So it is an investment of time and energy, and that is probably one of the major things to be aware of. They can be trickier to balance, especially again if you're a new GM. If you don't have much experience with what sort of encounters are going to be too challenging and what are going to be too easy, that can be a difficult task. Whilst there are many great tools out there to help, there is certainly an element of experience which you won't have, which will help you and can lead to problems down the road. You need to keep track of all your own notes. You need to draw your own maps. You need to, even if you're using online tools, even if you're Googling D&D maps and basically copying them, you still have to go through that process. So again, it just kind of ties back into homebrew content is just generally a lot more work, and it can be overwhelming, especially if you're a new GM. But let's talk about the positives. Homebrew is a bit easier to talk about because it's not as sort of in-depth. The first one is that it's creatively rewarding. You get to create your own worlds and adventures and plots and stories. So whilst, yes, that is a con because it's a lot of work, it's also a pro because it's so wonderfully satisfying. It is generally a very nice feeling that players are enjoying something you've fully created. It makes you feel a bit like a novel writer or a world builder, and it's generally very, very exciting. It allows you to incorporate player stories or even player content much, much more easily. Your players can come up with locations, villains, kingdoms, all based on their character backstory that you can then use to give them a much more rewarding and meaningful game experience. Other benefits is it's completely free. All you need is the free basic D&D rules and your own imagination, and you can create and create and create and develop your own systems and games and everything else. There's nothing really to stop you. So it's free as opposed to buying more books and more resources that you might need to do for an existing module or campaign. Finally, with homebrew content, I genuinely find it easier to improvise. It's a world you know up in your head. It's one that you spent a lot of time thinking about. You've developed the stories. You know roughly where everything's going to go. So I generally find it easier to come up with stuff on the fly because you know more about it necessarily. Whilst you can do this with homebrew if you do a lot of research and read through the books, I think with homebrew it's already up here, so it's just that little bit easier to kind of go like, oh yeah, blah 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 blah, and you can lead players back to where you want them to be just because you happen to know more about what's going on. So there's a bunch of pros and cons really. If you're an experienced GM, by the way, and you think that I've left something out, if you feel like I've not covered a topic that should be messaged, please do post it in the comments. Obviously be respectful and appreciate that many people might be new and I might have a different way of thinking, but I'd love to hear from you. Do make sure you post that in the comments down below. But if those are the pros and cons, you might be thinking, oh God, I can't choose. I want to do this, but I don't want to do that. I want to do that, but I don't want to do this. Which one do I pick? Well, don't worry, because there is a third option. Much like one of my favorite games of all time, Mass Effect 3, there is a third option to all of this. It's not red, it's not blue, it's green. We'll save my personal opinions for how the ending of that game was handled for somewhere else, perhaps a Twitch stream. But there is a third option in the middle, which merges the two major aspects of this. You can run a module, such as Curse of Strahd, or Storm King's Thunder, Horde of the Dragon Queen, or Tomb of Annihilation, and add your own custom content to it. It sounds obvious, and you're probably a couple of steps ahead of me, but there's nothing stopping you from running something like the Mines of Phandelver from the Dungeons & Dragons starter set and going, oh man, we're having fun, we're enjoying it, but Dave's got this idea in his character of this mercenary company that betrayed him. I really like the idea of maybe them coming into town and causing trouble. There's nothing stopping you from writing scenarios, whole adventures that take place in amongst all of this stuff that's going on in the pre-written modules. Likewise, vice versa, if you're running homebrew content and you're struggling for ideas, or even if you're not struggling for ideas, if you just want to kind of have a bit of relax, you want to get something a bit easier, you haven't got the time to necessarily prepare something, there's nothing wrong with taking some content from these kind of established modules and adventures and adding it into your own homebrew campaign. To give you an anecdotal example of this, currently in the High Rollers campaign setting, I'm using heavy influences from Curse of Strahd, and I'm even name-calling it out. I'm having the characters reference a figure called Strahd who has given them certain powers and influence. There's nothing wrong with that. Not only is it going to save you time, but it adds something a little bit different. It does all the hard work for you, but to your players, they might not know that I'm running something that I'm going to use stuff from Curse of Strahd. Mine do, because they watch these videos, but you get the idea. Nobody's going to know if you take a whole dungeon from the Princes of Elemental Evil and reskin it, add different monsters, or call it by a different name. Nobody's going to know. The players are still going to have fun, and it might just save you a couple of weeks of work when you're really, really stressed and busy. There's nothing wrong with it, and in fact, you can get the best of both worlds by doing this. As another tip, you can even take old modules or old campaign settings, revitalize them for new editions or for other game systems. There's nothing to say you couldn't take some of the themes in, I don't know, Curse of Strahd or Storm King's Thunder and adapt them to be more Star Warsy. Run them in Fantasy Flight Games' Edge of the Empire or Age of Rebellion. Take elements, take what you think works about it, and then just reshape it for a system. Yes, you'll need to change the encounters. It will be different monsters, different dice rolls. You might need to adjust the skills used or things like that. But generally in most of these modules, they're really just narrative structures. They're providing you locations and villains and motivations, and all of that stuff is so easily translatable. You could take Pathfinder adventures, make them for D&D 5e. You could take 2nd edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons modules and update them. You can take parts of those and throw them in. Another anecdotal example, for the Dead Reckoning High Roller series we did for Wizards of the Coast, I used an ancient module, an ancient setting book called for Red Wizards of Thay. I took a lot was in that book, adapted it, even using many of the story hooks and the NPCs that featured it, and just tweaked it a little bit to develop my own sort of flavour of campaign. This is the secret art to DMing. It's something we'll talk about in a future episodes, but the wizard behind the curtain, the players don't ever see them. And that means you've got a lot of freedom to just cheat and do things like this. Merge two things and find the best solution for you. That's to the end of today's lesson, but before we go, this is a new little segment I want to introduce. I'm going to give you guys some homework. Now, obviously, you don't have to do this. I'm not a real teacher, despite what the Blazer says. I'm not a real teacher, but it's something for you to think about. In preparation for your next game, whether you're a first-time GM or a veteran, whether you're running a module or custom content, go home, have a think about it. And if you're running a module, try and come up with your own custom content. Nothing more than a couple of encounters and a small little narrative plot line to kind of tie it together. But kind of come up with your own. See if you can add something into that module that will spice things up a little bit, that might involve your players' backstories a bit more. Add that little bit of spice just to give them something a bit different. And if you're a GM who's running your own custom world, your own custom rules and content, why not have a look at some of the module books you might have bought, or some of the ones you can find online for free? See if there's ideas that you can use from those in your campaign to save you a little bit of time. See if there's a cool dungeon or a cool encounter or something like that that you can just plop in and plop out, and that sounds really dodgy. You can take and just put into your current game and see if it helps you out a little bit. See if it takes away a little bit of that stress and just makes things a little bit easier in terms of your prep. So there you go. That's my little task for you this week. We'll be back with more DM 101 next week, as always, and we'll hopefully be starting on some more exciting stuff, talking about actually creating campaigns, the basics of things you need to think about, and how to get started, all that kind of good stuff. There'll be more from me. Don't forget to check out the rest of Tabletop Weekly. Lots of videos and that coming out as well. And please do check all the links in the description. That's the one for ways that you can support me and everything else. And as always, please do share this video around if you think it will be useful to people. I hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you very much for watching. Good luck with your campaigns. Good luck with your games, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.